that's another. I think we may have mentioned this in the last session, but you know, I used to think that coolant manufacturers were just trying to sell and make more money by giving you the pre-mixed stuff. Well, my friend Rob over at Heister Forklifts is the engineer there, and his job is cooling systems. And he taught me. He said, no. You do want to buy the pre-mixed coolant, the 50-50, because if you mix it with tap water or you know, your garden hose, you're opening your radiator up to mineral deposits, and it'll.
Not here in Portland.
Well,
other places, yes.
Okay, but he did also tell me that the pH levels of their mix is proper. The chemical makeup, you know, the water that they use when they mix the premix is optimum. Okay, so buy the premix. You don't have to mix it yourself. So anyway,
you don't even have to mix it. Why
would you
want
want
to
to
mix it?
Talking about your red line.
Red line additive?
Yeah, you have.
Oh, a water wetter. Water wetter. Well, Ward probably knows, and Andy from the racing. You know.
The Amsoil coolant boost is better than red line water.
Is it really?
Yes.
I didn't even know it was available.
It's proven. If you look at the tech sheet on it, it's proven to cool better.
Ah.
I put a little bit of that red line in. You said too.
Yeah.
Try my temperature, probably 10 degrees.
Nice.
Cruising.
Nice. And they say optimally, water wetter and water. No coolant. Just water and water wetter.
You do that for racing because of the fact that if you do spill it out
They don't want coolant on the
it's
track.
damn hard to clean up the antifreeze because it doesn't dry up.
Stay slippery.
So they ruled out any antifreeze in your motor for racing. So
well, if you read the bottle on Redline too, they also say for optimum cooling, you know, if you're in really hot temperatures, water and water wetter. But anyway, so that's, you could spend an afternoon talking about coolants too. Let's get to starting an engine, right?
One other thing
yes.
relates to coolant hoses.
Oh yeah, check your rubber hoses. You know, there's two things rubber doesn't like: age and heat.
especially English rubber.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you know, check your rubber hoses. Make sure your hose clamps are tight. Make sure everything's ready. Go ahead and pull your spark plugs out. Inspect your plugs. All right. And if it's a fresh rebuild or a motor that's been sitting for a really long time, well, better make sure that we have some oil pressure.
Can I go back to
yes,
coolant?
Yes.
Open your heater valve.
Ah, good idea. Absolutely. Open the heater valve so you can circulate the coolant through the core as well.
There's probably two different things you're talking about. A motor that sat around for a couple of years and one that you just freshly built probably have two different starting procedures.
They do. Absolutely.
You definitely want to oil the barrels down and crank them over so that you can expand the rings first, because other than that, if you start it up without oil in it, the rings can stick on the piston, and then they'll just smoke like mad and never have any compression, so then you have to tear them down. Other than that, sometimes you can get them to expand by putting a shot of oil in there and putting the spark plug back in and cranking it around so you expand the rings.
So what we're talking about is when you have your spark plugs out, is take an oil can, you know, with a dropper, and squirt the oil down the cylinders and literally crank it over. What we'll do is, if you don't have a sump system where you can get full oil pressure before starting the engine, which is really nice, but that's race cars and these are street cars, so.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
I kind of disagree with that. In reality, a dry motor is still a dry motor.
Yeah.
And it's kind of nice to get everything lubed up.
Of course it is. But none of these people have a sump, an AccuSump in their cars.
Well, yes, I know, but like I say, you just made a blank statement there, but in reality, it is kind of nice to get the oil pressure up, or at least things oiled up before you try and light it off.
Oh yeah, that's what I was getting to. Yeah. Crank the engine over until you see oil pressure. All right.
That's the worst thing you could do for your Cannonball.
Yeah. What are you gonna do though? You got to get some oil pressure.
What you do is you take and make sure everything is set up right with enough oil in it, and you just fire it up and get it over with.
Yes.
Well, you get instant oil pressure,
Yeah.
You get instant oiling on things, cause your cam, number one is that it's an antique cam setup, so you don't have oil pressure fed, so the only thing that you can get the cam to oil with is with the oil that's flowing off the bearings and stuff like that, cause other than that, you just have a pre-lube on it.
Yeah.
And if you crank the thing over, basically you pretty much squeegee off all your pre-lube, and then when you're lighting it off, basically you don't have that there, so you're actually better off to just go ahead and light the motor off.
And when that happens, this is really important on a freshly rebuilt motor. It is critical, it's vital, that when the engine does fire, to run it at least 2,000 to 2,500 RPMs for 20 minutes to 30 minutes.
Just make sure you got the oil pressure up.
Yeah, and it doesn't overheat. You know, you got to make sure that's happening. At the same time, when it is running at that, we will check our timing, make sure that we're not too far advanced, because that will overheat a motor real quick too. We set our timing at 32 degrees at 4,000 RPM with the vacuum advance disconnected. Okay, and once we set it at 32 degrees at 4,000 RPM, we'll lock down the distributor, hook the vacuum advance back up. Okay. When you're running that brand new camshaft in at 2,000 to 2,500, it's what's happening is you're getting those cam followers to rotate. They've got to rotate. It's really critical. You can wipe out a camshaft in a hurry if you don't break it in properly.
A lot of them never ever rotate it. And that's how they wear them out, is because of the fact that they're not aligned properly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes you have to slip more than one gasket underneath that front plate to be able to pull the cam off center and be able to get them to rotate.
Right. So that's really important to make sure that the
Well, and the other
Can't
thing
follow.
Ward said, this technology is pretty much 1930s.
it's ancient.
It's one
These are-
step above
They do
full
have
splash
camshaft now that are
lubrication.
oil pressure-
Yeah.
And
They do have camshaft now that are oil pressure fed, because well, I'll tell you what, should have had them back in 1936. So.
yeah, and that's the other thing. You're throwing oil
Uh-huh.
around in there and keeping the crankshaft
Yeah.
during that critical early break-in of the surfaces.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
so-
And let's assume that you had an engine that's been sitting for a really long time and you have no oil pressure. Okay? That is because what you have to do is pull the oil pressure relief, which is the big nut or bolt right below the oil pressure line. There's a spring with a oil pressure relief in there. You remove that, and the only way I've been able to get some of those oil pressure reliefs is put your pinky in there and grab it and pull it out. Try a magnet first, but if that doesn't do it,
There's another tool,
yes.
hydraulic valve lifter tool.
Oh yeah, that would work.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a good
I use
idea.
that on my VW engines.
So once you get your oil pressure relief out, what you have to do is rotate the motor backwards while pumping motor oil down it. Okay, the motor's been sitting so long that the oil has completely drained out of the oil pump, and it's not actually sucking the oil up into the oiling system. So you have to prime it.
Probably a little easier to actually prime it through the bolt that comes up to the front, because it runs downhill to the oil pump.
Yes. Yeah.
Pulling your oil pressure relief valve out, unless of course you have some sort of oil pressure relief valve problems.
You could do either one. That's a really good idea.
Yeah, I just find that it's easier to drain it downhill out of that pipe that comes out of the block right there to be able to prime it.
And still
then just
rotate.
they can put it in high gear and shove the car back a few rotations and
There you go.
suck it
Yeah.
right in. So.
Yeah. You do want to rotate the motor backwards. That will draw the oil into the oil pump. So, I've put, probably 4 or 5 tablespoons, but more is better. Just get as much in there as you can.
Yeah, make
Alright.
sure you got it primed.
Yeah.
Usually when you put them together, I like to take the oil pump over to the drill press and put oil in them and run them to begin with, to be able to oil them up.
You'll
Be
see a lot of
surprised how
crud
much-
come out of them when you do that.
Be surprised how much crud comes out of the oil pump breaking itself in to begin with, so it's kinda nice to pre-run the oil pump
Yeah.
and then put it in the motor basically, cause other than that, the first thing you do is throw your motor a bunch of junk.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Well,
got-
so I've actually, bought a few minis, and people have brought us minis that had no oil pressure, and they're like, it did when I parked it. Well, it sat so long that, you know, there's no more oil pressure because it's dry. So what we're doing is priming it and getting the oil pressure